The city lights of San Francisco glimmered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Meridian Gallery, casting geometric shadows across polished marble floors. Victoria Chen stood at the center of her newest acquisition, a contemporary art space in the heart of the financial district, watching guests admire the carefully curated collection. Her black silk dress whispered against the floor as she moved between clusters of art enthusiasts and investors, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. At 42, Victoria had built her fortune from algorithms and innovation, creating software that revolutionized data security. The tech world knew her as brilliant and ruthless in business, but few understood her passion for art. This gallery represented something different, a space where beauty mattered more than profit margins, where human expression took precedence over quarterly earnings. The evening had progressed smoothly until her assistant, Margaret, approached with concern etched across her features. Margaret leaned close and spoke in hushed tones about a disturbance in the storage area. Victoria excused herself from a conversation with a prominent collector and followed Margaret through a discreet door marked Staff Only. The back corridor felt colder, stripped of the gallery's warmth and light. Fluorescent bulbs hummed overhead as they navigated past crated paintings and bubble-wrapped sculptures. Margaret pointed toward the far corner where several large canvases leaned against the wall. Victoria approached cautiously and found a young man crouched between two wooden crates, his body trembling despite the warm evening. He looked to be in his late 20s, with paint-stained fingers and dark hair falling across his forehead. His face was pale, almost translucent in the harsh lighting, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. Victoria knelt beside him, her designer dress forgotten, as her knees touched the cold concrete floor. "Can you hear me?" she asked, keeping her voice steady and calm. Her mind raced through emergency protocols learned from countless corporate safety training sessions. The young man's eyes opened slowly, revealing irises the color of storm clouds. He focused on her face with difficulty, as though seeing through fog. His lips moved, forming words that barely reached her ears. "It hurts," he whispered, his voice breaking on the second word. "It hurts so much." Victoria reached for her phone to call emergency services, but his hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. The touch sent a jolt through her, not from pain but from the desperation in his eyes. "Please," he managed. "No ambulance. Cannot afford it. I just need a moment." She studied his face more carefully and noticed the fine tremors running through his body, the way he held his left side as though protecting something fragile. His clothes, though clean, showed signs of wear. Paint stains created an unintentional pattern across his faded jeans and threadbare sweater. "Tell me your name," Victoria said, ignoring his protest about the ambulance. She needed to keep him talking and conscious. "Oliver," he replied after a pause. "Oliver Hayes." Recognition flickered in her memory. Margaret had mentioned a new artist, whose work had been submitted for consideration, someone whose paintings showed remarkable talent, but whose personal circumstances remained mysterious. The gallery had 3 of his pieces in storage, awaiting her final approval for the upcoming exhibition. "Oliver Hayes, the painter," Victoria said. "Your work arrived last week, the seascapes with the fractured light." Something close to pride flickered across his pained expression. "You saw them?" "I was planning to review them tomorrow," she said. "But I think we should focus on getting you help right now." He shook his head, wincing at the movement. "I came to drop off 2 more pieces. Wanted to finish the series before the exhibition." The side door was open. I felt dizzy and sat down. Then the pain started again. Victoria noticed a leather portfolio leaning against the wall nearby, presumably containing his additional work. She turned her attention back to Oliver, noting the way his skin had taken on a grayish hue. This was more than simple exhaustion or dehydration. "How long have you been in pain like this?" she asked. Oliver closed his eyes, and for a moment she thought he might have lost consciousness. Then he spoke, his words tumbling out in a rush as though confessing a long-held secret. 8 months, he said. Started as an ache. Then it grew, worse. The doctors ran tests and found a degenerative nerve condition. It affects my spine and radiates through my entire body. Some days I can barely hold a brush. Victoria felt her chest tighten. She had built her empire on solving problems and finding solutions where others saw only obstacles. This young man's pain represented a challenge she had not encountered in boardrooms or investment meetings. "There must be treatment available," she said. Oliver's laugh came out bitter and sharp. "There is. An experimental drug that could stop the progression, maybe even reverse some of the damage. The clinical trials showed remarkable results, but the pharmaceutical company decided not to release it for general use. Too expensive to manufacture, they claimed, not enough profit margin." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She had insulated herself from the harsh realities many faced, living in a world where money solved most problems. The idea that someone suffered needlessly because of corporate calculations made her blood run cold. "How much does this treatment cost?" she asked. $50,000 for the initial treatment, Oliver said, then $30,000 every 3 months to maintain it. I paint portraits on weekends and teach art classes during the week. My insurance considers it experimental and refuses coverage. I have been saving for 2 years and have barely scraped. Together, $15,000. Victoria's mind worked quickly, calculating and planning. $50,000 represented less than she spent on a single painting at auction. The ongoing cost amounted to what she might pay for a weekend getaway. Yet for Oliver, it represented an insurmountable barrier between suffering and relief. "The pain is manageable most days," Oliver continued. "I take over-the-counter medication and push through. But lately it has been getting worse. I wanted to finish this series before I could not paint anymore. Art is the only thing that makes sense when everything else feels like chaos." Victoria understood that sentiment more than he realized. After her divorce 3 years ago, she had thrown herself into collecting art, finding solace in the way artists transformed pain into beauty, chaos into meaning. "Let me make a call," she said, pulling out her phone. Oliver tried to protest, but she silenced him with a look that had intimidated countless executives. She dialed her personal physician, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who owed her several favors after Victoria had funded a new wing at her hospital. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. Victoria explained the situation in clinical terms, describing Oliver's condition and the experimental treatment he needed. Dr. Martinez asked a few questions and promised to make arrangements immediately. When Victoria ended the call, she found Oliver staring at her with an expression caught between hope and disbelief. "I have arranged for you to see a specialist tomorrow morning," she said. "Dr. Martinez will handle the paperwork and initial consultation. As for the cost of treatment, consider it covered." "I cannot accept that," Oliver said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I am nobody. Just a struggling artist who happened to collapse in your gallery." Victoria stood and extended her hand to help him up. "You are an artist whose work moved me enough to consider it for exhibition. You are a person in pain who asked a simple question. That is enough." Oliver took her hand and rose slowly, his body still trembling but stronger than before. As he steadied himself against the wall, Victoria retrieved his portfolio and opened it carefully. Inside were 2 paintings that took her breath away. The first showed a figure standing at the edge of a cliff, body bent in an attitude of agony, while above them, the sky fractured into shards of brilliant color, light bleeding through darkness. The second depicted hands reaching upward through turbulent water, fingers straining toward a surface that seemed impossibly distant. "These are remarkable," Victoria said softly. "They capture something essential about suffering and hope." Oliver looked at his own work as though seeing it for the first time. "I paint what I feel. The pain gives me clarity sometimes. It strips away everything unnecessary and leaves only truth." Victoria met his gaze and saw past the physical suffering to the fierce determination beneath. She recognized that quality, having built her fortune through similar resilience. "Tomorrow you will begin treatment," she said firmly. "And next month your work will hang in the main gallery. I want people to see what you have created. They need to understand that beauty often emerges from our darkest moments." Oliver nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening his throat. Victoria called for Margaret to bring water and arrange transportation to take him home. As they waited, she found herself thinking about the question he had asked, the simple words that revealed so much complexity. "It hurts." 2 words that contained universes of meaning. Physical pain, emotional anguish, the hurt of being denied relief because of factors beyond one's control. Victoria had insulated herself from such vulnerabilities, believing money and success created an impenetrable shield. Oliver's collapse in her gallery shattered that illusion. When the car arrived, Victoria accompanied him outside, ignoring the surprised looks from gallery guests. She watched the vehicle disappear into the San Francisco night, then returned to the exhibition. But the evening had transformed. She looked at the art with new eyes, seeing past technical skill and market value to the human stories behind each piece. Later that night, alone in her penthouse overlooking the bay, Victoria stood by the window with a glass of wine untouched in her hand. The city sprawled below, millions of lights representing millions of lives, each carrying their own burdens and pain. She had discovered something that shocked her, not in Oliver's condition itself, but in her own response to it. The question he had asked, so softly and simply, had cracked open something she had kept carefully sealed. It reminded her that beneath the algorithms and acquisitions, beneath the carefully constructed empire, she remained human, capable of being moved by another's suffering. That realization frightened and exhilarated her in equal measure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Oliver's treatment represented only the beginning. Victoria sensed that his whispered question had set something in motion, a chain of events that would reveal truths she had not anticipated. The city lights blurred slightly as exhaustion finally caught up with her, but she remained at the window, thinking about pain and art, about the cost of healing and the price of indifference. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Dr. James Peterson's office at the Coastal Medical Research Facility, creating stripes of light across stacks of patient files and medical journals. He sat behind his desk, reading the referral that had arrived from Dr. Rebecca Martinez with growing interest. The case described a young artist with a degenerative nerve condition requiring immediate access to Neuraxil, the experimental drug his facility had helped develop 3 years ago. James had been one of the lead researchers on the Neuraxil project, watching with pride as the clinical trials produced remarkable results. Patients who had suffered from chronic nerve pain found relief within weeks. Some regained functionality they had lost years before. The drug represented a genuine breakthrough in pain management and nerve regeneration. Then the pharmaceutical company, Sentinel BioTech, had acquired the patent and buried it. The official statement claimed manufacturing costs made widespread distribution unfeasible. James knew better. He had seen the production reports and cost analyses. The real reason was simpler and more cynical. Sentinel made billions from existing pain medications that patients needed to take continuously. Neuraxil offered the possibility of actual healing, which meant fewer repeat customers. He picked up the phone and dialed the extension for Nina Torres, the head physical therapist who had worked alongside him during the trials. Nina answered. On the second ring, her voice warm and energetic despite the early hour. "James, good morning. Please tell me you have good news about the Hernandez case." "Different case," James said, "but potentially more significant. I need you to review a patient file and give me your honest assessment." 20 minutes later, Nina sat across from him, reading through Oliver Hayes's medical history with increasing dismay. Her dark eyes moved quickly across the pages, occasionally pausing to reread a section. At 36, Nina had dedicated her career to helping patients recover from neurological injuries. She had witnessed too many people suffer needlessly because of insurance denials and prohibitive costs. "This is exactly the kind of case Neuraxil was designed for," she said, setting down the file. "The progression matches what we saw in trial. Group B. If we start treatment now, we could potentially reverse 60 to 70% of the existing damage." "That is what I thought," James agreed. "Dr. Martinez mentioned that a private benefactor is covering the costs. Someone named Victoria Chen." Nina's eyebrows rose. "The tech billionaire? I read about her new art gallery in the Chronicle last week. Apparently, the patient is an artist whose work she admires. She discovered him in distress and decided to intervene." "That is remarkably generous," Nina said. "But it raises a troubling question. How many others are suffering because they do not have a billionaire patron?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. James had been asking himself the same thing for 3 years, ever since Sentinel had shelved Neuraxil. He had tried working through official channels, submitting petitions to medical boards and reaching out to patient advocacy groups. Every effort had been met with polite refusals or bureaucratic delays. "I have been thinking about this a lot lately," James said carefully, "about how much we compromised when we allowed Sentinel to acquire the patent. We told ourselves it was necessary to bring the drug to market. But what good is a cure that no one can access?" Nina leaned forward, her expression intense. "Are you suggesting what I think you are suggesting?" "I am suggesting we treat Mr. Hayes and document every aspect of his recovery. Then we present that documentation to someone who can actually do something about it. A journalist, perhaps, or a medical ethics committee." "That could destroy your career," Nina pointed out. "Sentinel has lawyers who would bury you in litigation." "My career means nothing if I am complicit in preventable suffering," James replied. His voice carried a conviction that surprised even himself. "We took an oath to do no harm. Right now, our silence is causing harm." Nina nodded slowly, respect and concern mingling in her expression. "Then we need to be smart about this. Document everything, but keep it secure. If we are going to expose what Sentinel has done, we need evidence they cannot dispute." The conversation was interrupted by James's assistant announcing that Oliver Hayes had arrived for his consultation. Nina gathered the files and followed James to the examination room, where they found Oliver sitting on the edge of the medical table, his posture radiating anxiety. Victoria Chen stood near the window, her presence transforming the clinical space into something that felt more like a corporate negotiation. She wore a tailored gray suit, and her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, every inch the successful executive. But when she looked at Oliver, something softened in her expression. James introduced himself and Nina, then began a thorough examination. He asked Oliver to describe the pain, its frequency and intensity, how it affected his daily activities. Oliver answered honestly, his words painting a picture of someone who had learned to function despite constant suffering. "The worst part is not knowing when it will strike," Oliver explained. "I can be in the middle of painting, completely focused, and then it hits like lightning through my spine. My hands shake so badly I have to stop, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days." Nina took notes, her expression thoughtful. She had Oliver perform a series of movements, testing his range of motion and neurological responses. Each test revealed the extent of the damage, confirming what the medical records had indicated. "The good news is that you are an excellent candidate for Neuraxil treatment," James said when the examination concluded. "Based on what we have seen today, I believe we can significantly reduce your pain and restore much of the functionality you have lost." "How long before I see results?" Oliver asked, hope evident in his voice. The initial treatment takes about 4 hours, Nina explained. You will receive an infusion through an IV. Most patients notice some improvement within 48 hours. Full benefits typically manifest over 6 to 8 weeks, with continued improvement over the following months. Victoria had remained quiet during the examination, but now she spoke. What are the risks? James appreciated her directness. The clinical trials showed minimal side effects. Some patients experienced mild nausea or headaches during the first week. There is a small risk of allergic reaction, which is why we monitor patients closely during the initial infusion. And the success rate? Victoria pressed. In trials, 87% of patients with conditions similar to Mr. Hayes experienced significant improvement. 63% achieved what we classify as complete remission of symptoms. The numbers spoke for themselves, but James saw Victoria processing something deeper. She was calculating not just medical outcomes, but implications. He recognized that look from his own mirror. I want to be clear about something, Victoria said. I am covering the costs for Mr. Hayes because I can. But you both know this is not a sustainable solution. How many others need this treatment and cannot access it? Nina glanced at James, a silent question in her eyes. He made a quick decision, trusting his instinct about Victoria's character. Hundreds, possibly thousands, James said. Sentinel BioTech owns the patent for Neuraxil. They have chosen not to manufacture it in quantities sufficient for general use. The official reason is cost, but the real reason is profit protection. Victoria's expression hardened. Explain that to me. James outlined the situation, describing how Sentinel made enormous profits from traditional pain medications that required continuous use. Neuraxil threatened that revenue stream by offering actual healing rather than symptom management. By keeping the drug scarce and expensive, Sentinel maintained their market dominance while appearing to support cutting-edge research. That is unconscionable, Victoria said, her voice tight with anger. People are suffering because of a business decision. That is exactly right, Nina agreed. And there is nothing illegal about it. Pharmaceutical companies have the right to set their own prices and production schedules. Medical ethics and business ethics do not always align. Victoria pulled out her phone and typed rapidly. I need to make some calls. James, Nina, I want you to proceed with Mr. Hayes' treatment and document everything meticulously. In the meantime, I am going to look into Sentinel BioTech's operations. Oliver had been listening to the conversation with growing understanding. This is bigger than just me, is it not? You are planning something. I am planning to ensure that what happened to you does not happen to others, Victoria said firmly. But first, we get you healthy. Then we figure out how to fix a broken system. James felt something shift in the room, a sense of purpose coalescing among 4 people who had been strangers an hour ago. He had spent years feeling powerless against corporate indifference. Now, with Victoria's resources and determination, perhaps change was actually possible. As they scheduled Oliver's first treatment, James noticed Nina watching Victoria with thoughtful calculation. Later, when Oliver and Victoria had left, Nina cornered him in his office. We need to be careful, she said. Sentinel has a reputation for crushing anyone who threatens their interests. If Victoria starts digging, they will notice. Let them notice, James replied. For 3 years, I have watched people suffer while we did nothing. Maybe it is time someone with enough money and influence forced the issue. Nina smiled grimly. Then we better make sure our documentation is flawless, because when this goes public, Sentinel will come after all of us. James looked at the patient files stacked on his desk, each representing someone denied access to life-changing treatment. The risk to his career suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of making a real difference. I can live with that, he said. Across the city, in a glass tower overlooking the financial district, Robert Sullivan sat in his corner office at Sentinel BioTech, reviewing quarterly earnings reports. The numbers looked excellent, as always. Pain medications represented their most profitable division, generating billions in annual revenue. His assistant buzzed through on the intercom. "Mr. Sullivan, there is a call from our legal department. Something about inquiries into the Neuraxil patent." Robert frowned. Neuraxil had been safely buried for years. Who was asking questions now? He picked up the phone, unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to collide with forces he had not anticipated. Grace Hamilton had been an investigative journalist for 15 years, long enough to recognize when a story had teeth. She sat in her cluttered apartment in Oakland, surrounded by printouts and sticky notes, piecing together information about Sentinel BioTech that did not quite add up. The company's public statements about Neuraxil contradicted their own internal research reports, which she had obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request months ago. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A man named Thomas Wright had contacted her through an encrypted email service, claiming to be a senior financial analyst at Sentinel. He said he had documents proving the company had deliberately suppressed Neuraxil to protect profits from their existing pain medication line. Grace had learned to be skeptical of anonymous sources, but something about his message felt genuine. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop near the Oakland waterfront, a place busy enough to provide cover but quiet enough for conversation. Thomas arrived precisely on time, a thin man in his early 50s with graying hair and tired eyes. He carried a leather briefcase that he clutched like a lifeline. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, settling into the booth across from Grace. "I have been trying to find someone who would listen for 2 years. Grace pulled out her recorder and notepad. "Tell me everything, but first, I need to understand what changed. You have worked at Sentinel for how long?" 23 years, Thomas replied. "I started in accounting and worked my way up to senior financial analyst. I believed in the company's mission, or at least I wanted to. Then, my daughter developed the same nerve condition that Neuraxil was designed to treat." His voice cracked slightly on the last sentence. Grace waited, giving him time to compose himself. "Caroline is 28, Thomas continued. "She was a dancer before the pain started. I watched her deteriorate over 18 months, tried every treatment insurance would cover. Nothing worked. Then I remembered Neuraxil and looked into getting it for her. That is when I discovered what we had done." "What exactly did you discover?" Grace asked, her pen poised over the notepad. Thomas opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder. "Internal memos showing that our executive team deliberately limited Neuraxil production. Cost analysis proving the drug could be manufactured profitably at a fraction of the current price. Marketing reports demonstrating that widespread Neuraxil availability would reduce our pain medication revenue by 40%. Grace flipped through the documents, her journalist instincts recognizing gold when she saw it. Each page contained damning evidence of corporate malfeasance, decisions made in boardrooms that translated to suffering for thousands of patients. "These are explosive," she said carefully, "but I need to verify everything independently. Sentinel will bring an army of lawyers if we publish this." "I know," Thomas said. "That is where things get interesting. 3 weeks ago, a woman named Victoria Chen started making inquiries about Neuraxil. Her attorneys have been requesting information, filing petitions, making noise. I think she is planning something bigger than just helping one patient." Grace recognized the name immediately. Victoria Chen was tech royalty, someone with enough money and influence to actually challenge Sentinel. If she could connect Thomas's documents to Victoria's investigation, the story became exponentially more powerful. "Do you know how to reach her?" Grace asked. Thomas smiled for the first time since sitting down. "I was hoping you would ask that. I have a contact number for her assistant. I think Ms. Chen would be very interested in what I have to share." 2 days later, Grace found herself in Victoria's penthouse office, watching the billionaire review Thomas's documents with the focused intensity of someone analyzing code. Oliver sat nearby, his arm hooked to an IV stand administering his second Neuraxil treatment. The juxtaposition struck Grace as deliberately symbolic, the sick man being healed while they discussed how many others had been denied the same opportunity. "This is worse than I thought," Victoria said, setting down a particularly damning memo. "They knew Neuraxil could help thousands of people, and they buried it anyway. Not because of manufacturing challenges, but because healing patients is less profitable than managing their symptoms forever." "That is the pharmaceutical industry in a nutshell," Grace replied. "But proving it and getting people to care are two different challenges. We need a strategy that goes beyond just publishing an exposé." Nina Torres, who had joined them at Victoria's invitation, leaned forward. "What if we approach this from multiple angles simultaneously? Grace publishes her investigation exposing the documents. Victoria files a lawsuit challenging Sentinel's patent rights. James and I present our medical findings to ethics boards and patient advocacy groups. And I provide testimony about the internal decision-making process," Thomas added. "I can walk regulators through exactly how these choices were made and who made them." Victoria nodded slowly, her mind clearly working through scenarios and contingencies. "We need to move quickly. Once Sentinel realizes what we are doing, they will try to bury us in legal motions and counter-publicity." "There is one more element we should consider," Oliver said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. The treatments had improved his condition dramatically over the past 3 weeks. The constant pain that had defined his existence had diminished to manageable levels. His hands no longer trembled when he painted. "I have been working on something," Oliver continued. "A new series of paintings that document what I experienced. The pain, the desperation, the relief when treatment finally came. Art has a way of making abstract suffering concrete and personal. People might ignore statistics, but they cannot ignore a human face." Grace felt the story crystallizing in her mind. This was not just about corporate greed or medical ethics. It was about real people, their suffering, and what happened when someone with resources decided to fight back. "We launch everything at once," she said. "My article goes live on the same day Victoria files her lawsuit. Oliver's exhibition opens simultaneously, showing the human cost of these decisions. Thomas provides his testimony to regulatory agencies. We overwhelm them before they can mount an effective defense." Victoria's expression turned calculating. "I can arrange a press conference at the gallery. We invite medical professionals, patient advocates, and journalists. Oliver's paintings provide the backdrop while we present the evidence." "When?" Nina asked. 2 weeks. Victoria said firmly. "That gives Grace time to complete her investigation, Oliver time to finish his paintings, and our legal team time to prepare the lawsuit. We coordinate with Thomas to ensure his testimony reaches the right people at the right moment." The plan took shape over the following hours, each person contributing their expertise. Grace would write the definitive exposé, connecting Thomas's documents to interviews with patients who had been denied Neuraxil. Victoria's lawyers would challenge Sentinel's patent on public health grounds. James and Nina would present medical evidence to ethics boards and congressional committees. Thomas would provide insider testimony to regulatory agencies, and Oliver would paint. He would transform his experience into art that made the abstract concrete, that forced viewers to confront the human cost of corporate indifference. As the meeting concluded, Grace found herself standing beside Oliver, watching him sketch preliminary ideas for his final painting. The image taking shape showed figures trapped behind glass walls, reaching toward light they could not quite grasp. "You are incredibly brave," she said, "sharing something so personal with the world." Oliver looked up from his sketch. "For years, I thought my pain was a private burden, something to hide and manage alone. Victoria showed me it was actually a shared experience, part of a larger system that needs to change. If my paintings can help even one person understand what that feels, then the vulnerability is worth it." 2 weeks later, the Meridian Gallery filled with people. Journalists, medical professionals, patient advocates, and curious citizens crowded into the space, drawn by the promise of significant revelations. Oliver's paintings hung on the walls, each depicting a different aspect of chronic pain and the journey toward healing. The final piece, hung in the place of honor, showed a figure emerging from darkness into fractured light, hands no longer reaching but open and free. Victoria stood at a podium, flanked by Grace, James, Nina, and Thomas. Behind them, a screen displayed key documents from Thomas's evidence cache. The crowd quieted as Victoria began to speak. 3 months ago, a young artist collapsed in this gallery, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the space. He asked a simple question that revealed a complex truth. Today, we are here to answer that question fully and to demand change. Grace stepped forward and outlined her investigation, presenting evidence of how Sentinel BioTech had deliberately suppressed a life-changing treatment to protect profits. The crowd murmured as damning memos appeared on the screen, internal communications that laid bare the company's calculations. Thomas provided context, explaining how financial analysts had projected revenue losses if Neuraxil became widely available. His voice remained steady as he described watching his own daughter suffer while knowing his employer possessed the means to help her. James and Nina presented medical data, showing exactly how many patients could benefit from Neuraxil treatment and what it would cost to manufacture the drug at scale. The numbers told a devastating story of preventable suffering. When the formal presentations concluded, reporters shouted questions. Camera flashes illuminated the gallery as news organizations scrambled to cover the breaking story. Oliver stood beside his paintings, answering questions about his experience and what the treatment had meant for his life and art. Within hours, the story exploded across social media and news outlets. Sentinel BioTech's stock price plummeted as investors absorbed the implications. Congressional representatives called for investigations. Patient advocacy groups organized protests outside Sentinel's headquarters. The pharmaceutical company tried to mount a defense, issuing statements about manufacturing challenges and research costs. But Thomas's documents had undermined their credibility. Every claim they made could be contradicted by their own internal communications. 3 days after the press conference, Sentinel's board of directors announced that Robert Sullivan had been removed as chief executive. His replacement immediately committed to making Neuraxil available at a dramatically reduced price, citing the company's responsibility to public health. Victoria watched the news from her penthouse, a glass of champagne in her hand. Oliver sat beside her, his latest painting propped against the window. It showed hands reaching toward each other across empty space, finally touching. "We did it," Oliver said softly. "We actually changed something." "You changed something," Victoria corrected. "Your question, your art, your willingness to be vulnerable. That is what made this possible." Oliver shook his head. "It took all of us. Your resources, Grace's investigation, Thomas's courage, James and Nina's expertise. One person asking for help and others deciding to answer." Victoria smiled, thinking about how much had changed in 3 months. She had discovered that wealth meant nothing if not used to create meaningful change. That the question, "It hurts," deserved more than sympathy. It demanded action. Across the city, in hospitals and clinics, patients who had suffered for years began receiving Neuraxil treatments. Thomas's daughter, Caroline, was among them. Grace's article won awards and sparked national conversations about pharmaceutical ethics. Oliver's paintings toured the country, each exhibition raising funds for patients who still could not afford treatment. And in a small office at the medical research facility, James and Nina began work on the next challenge, identifying other, suppressed treatments and building networks to expose them. The victory over Sentinel had proven that change was possible when people refused to accept suffering as inevitable. Victoria stood by her window that evening, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, people were hurting. But now she understood that the question itself contained power. It forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths. It demanded that those with resources and influence make a choice between comfort and action. She had made her choice, and in doing so, she had discovered something that shocked her more than any corporate scandal: the profound satisfaction that came from using privilege to dismantle systems that caused harm. It was messy, complicated, and deeply human. It was also the most meaningful work she had ever done. The end.